You didn't make some big announcement. There's no massive, dramatic falling out, right? You didn't just wake up one morning and decide, I'm cutting everyone off. It just happened, slowly. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a phenomenon that so many of us go through, but literally nobody talks about. So if you found yourself slowly, quietly fading from your social circles, well, you are in the exact right place. We are going to look at the psychology behind why this happens. And spoiler alert, it is incredibly validating.
You know how it goes. It usually starts with just one unanswered message that honestly felt like way too much effort. Then one friendship quietly moves to the background. You decline a single invitation because, honestly, the thought of performing for a room full of people suddenly feels so much heavier than just staying home in your sweatpants. And then another friendship shifts, and another. Until one day, you look up and realize your social world has gotten significantly smaller. But here is the craziest part, and I really want you to think about whether this resonates with you. It doesn't feel like a loss. Surprisingly, it feels like relief. It's like you're finally exhaling after holding your breath for years.
Naturally, this brings up a pretty massive question. Society pushes this deeply ingrained myth that if you're pulling back, it means you're broken, right? Most people who notice their social calendar shrinking instantly assume something is wrong with them. They worry, am I becoming antisocial? Am I isolating in a weird, concerning way? We are constantly told that the old you, the one who showed up to literally everything, replied instantly, and had this massive network, was somehow better or healthier. But as we're about to see, there's a huge psychological plot twist waiting for us.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, the mechanics of withdrawal.
When you start to quietly disappear, psychology actually tells us it does not happen all at once. You don't just fall off a sudden cliff. It happens in very specific, logical layers. The first layer is awareness, or what psychologists call social pattern recognition. And this isn't dramatic. It's a quiet recalibration. You just start noticing things you completely overlooked before. You notice a smile that doesn't quite reach someone's eyes, or the friend who only remembers you exist when they need a huge favor, or maybe that conversation that felt so deep until you realized on the drive home that nothing real was actually said. Once that clicks, you naturally move to step 2, energy accounting. Almost without trying, you start keeping track of what interactions actually cost you. You realize, okay, this person leaves me feeling lighter, but hanging out with that person feels like I just ran a marathon I never signed up for. And here's the absolute kicker. You cannot go back to not seeing what you now see. As your self-awareness develops, your brain becomes hypersensitive to the gap between what social interactions appear to be and what they actually are. Once you develop that sensitivity, you start spending your social energy so much more carefully. To everyone else on the outside, yeah, this totally looks like withdrawal. But from the inside, it's actually just you finally telling the truth about what you have left to give.
Which brings us to Section 2, the rare psychological trait.
So it turns out this whole phenomenon isn't just introversion or social anxiety. And while people definitely mistake it for depression, it is absolutely not that. Researchers have pinned down a very specific, measurable pattern in people who go through this kind of withdrawal. High self-monitoring combined with deep value alignment. In plain English, it means you are someone who's unusually aware of the exhausting gap between how you present yourself to the world, your performance, and who you actually are underneath. You literally feel that gap in real time. Look, most people move through life with a pretty thin layer of awareness about this gap. They perform, they adapt, they don't even bat an eye. But for you, living inside that gap is exhausting. Eventually, the energetic cost of keeping up that social performance becomes a price you are just no longer willing to pay.
So, the core takeaway here is huge. This is not a loss of social ability. It is the development of social honesty. You aren't suddenly incapable of connecting with human beings. You're just becoming significantly less willing to accept shallow substitutes for it. You've simply raised your standards for what makes an interaction actually worthwhile.
Now, let's look at Section 3, why it feels like relief.
This phase confuses so many people, and honestly, it brings up a lot of guilt. Think about it. You decline an invitation that would have taken you 3 days to recover from for just one single evening of performing. And instead of feeling bad, you feel rested. But because society beats it into our heads that a healthy person is always visible, always out there doing things, you almost don't trust that feeling of rest. Well, psychology has studied what happens to our well-being when we stop forcing social connections we don't really mean. And the findings? Incredibly consistent. Constant social motion, frequent but shallow, leads straight to depletion. On the flip side, authentic connection, even in tiny amounts, produces vastly more psychological well-being. It brings restoration.
So that relief you're feeling, it's not numbness. It is literally your nervous system recognizing the difference between being drained and being restored and finally choosing restoration. The ultimate difference is crystal clear. Having dozens of connections where you are never fully seen, that leaves you lonely in a way that just being in a crowded room cannot fix. But having 2 or 3 connections where you are genuinely known, now that is rare. Quick caveat here though, if your withdrawal becomes total, like if absolutely no one sees you and that solitude shifts from feeling restorative to feeling heavy, that is for sure something to pay attention to. Unhealthy isolation is a real thing, but if you're just pruning your social tree to get to more honest connections, you aren't disappearing, you are curating.
This brings us to a much deeper psychological framing. Section 4, persona versus the self.
The quiet disappearance you're going through, it's not the end of your story. It's actually just the messy middle of a profound psychological journey. The famous psychologist Carl Jung wrote a ton about this. On one side, you have the persona. That's the social mask, right? The version of you perfectly polished up for external consumption. On the other side is the self, what actually exists underneath all that. Jung believed that a central task of growing up psychologically is learning to live a lot less from the persona and way more from the self.
If you are pulling away, it just means you're in the gap. You've gotten too aware of the persona to comfortably maintain it anymore. But you haven't quite found the new environments or the right people where your true self can just show up without it costing you your peace. So you go quiet. Not because you're giving up on human connection, but because you're actually taking it seriously enough to stop settling for relationships that fall short. You're just waiting for the right rooms to walk into.
Let's bring it all together in Section 5, Arriving at Authentic Connection.
People who go through this process do not end up permanently alone. They end up differently connected, and that is an incredibly empowering future. Notice how your role starts to shift here. The old way was all about performed availability, right? Saying the comfortable thing just to keep the peace, living totally on the surface. But the new way? You become the person who is actually present when real things happen. You're the friend who says the true thing instead of just the comfortable thing. You become the person in the room whose silence actually means something, because when you do speak, your words carry the actual weight of someone who thought about them. Sure, your connections become fewer, but man, they carry so much more weight.
I really want this to sink in for you. You did not disappear because something is wrong with you. You disappeared because something inside you finally started telling the truth about what you actually have the energy for. And yes, absolutely, this truth costs you the ease of just belonging everywhere. It costs you the simplicity of blindly going along with the crowd. But what it bought you in return, a life that actually feels like yours.
You weren't running away from people. You were bravely walking towards something real. You literally traded a packed calendar and constant, exhausting social motion for connections that actually feel genuine, for conversations that leave you feeling more like yourself when they end than when they started. And that is a massive evolutionary win. It's something most people spend their entire lives blindly searching for.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to chew on. Which part of this quietly disappearing journey have you been living without the words for? Take a second to really think about that, because what you probably thought was a loss was actually an evolution all along. Keep walking towards what's real. Thanks so much for joining me today on this journey to understanding ourselves a little bit better, and I will see you in the next one.